Emancipation did not come from on high. Even the well-intentioned liberal myth that Lincoln freed the slaves, that is wrong. Lincoln was driven forward to take actions he had opposed because enslaved people were freeing themselves, and he had to go farther. He had to go farther because they'd already made it a fact on the ground that freedom was coming. They weren't waiting for the president to act. They were forcing the president to move. And that social process, which is the same social process of the civil rights movement, is something in these times where some of the great powers that be want to instill fear in us. And we need to understand that solidarity is the greatest antidote to fear in the world.
So David, you have just published a book, which is truly revelatory for many, many reasons. And you say it's inspired from freedom as an index of truth. You also tell us that truth is partisan. It's partisan because if it is about breaking the oppression against the oppressor, we need to actually have the courage to look deeper, not just at the facts at the surface, but at the systemic relations that shape our economy as such. You make a point that is, I think, quite groundbreaking. You're telling us that actually capitalism is not distinct from slavery, that in our minds we think of capitalism as, in fact, this realm of freedom, of opportunities that, in fact, distanced itself from the overt political oppression of slavery. You instead tell us a very different story. You tell us how slavery itself was capitalist, and how slaves were themselves a form of working class struggling to preserve and enhance their life over the extraction of capital from their masters. So to you, my question is, what is this capitalism, and how is it that looking at slaves as workers is an emancipatory perspective with respect to the usual narratives about slavery?
Well, thank you. And let me start both by thanking Clara for this generous invitation to share some thoughts related to my recent book on slavery and capitalism with you, and to Michelle, whose wisdom I look forward to hearing further in the conversation. Let me start with the question of freedom and truth, because the premise of this book that I've written is that any society founded on oppression is untrue. It is false. It is untrue because it is a violation of human dignity and human equality. As a result, truth cannot be on the side of the oppressors, because their system is false, because their system is grounded in injustice, and therefore it requires an abdication of truth. It's why truth is under attack, particularly in the historical field at the moment, because to tell historical truths is a dangerous enterprise for the powers that be. So one of the things I'm doing in this book is I'm challenging the myth that throughout the Caribbean, throughout Brazil and the southern United States, there was a system called slavery, and later it got replaced by capitalism. And I'm saying, no, that's not how the story works. The reality is that the slave plantations of the Atlantic world were among the most prosperous and profitable business enterprises in the world. Hundreds of enslaved people, the vast majority in the first 100 years, kidnapped from Africa and sold into bondage, produced global commodities, sugar, coffee, cotton, tobacco, indigo, and more. And all of the wealth flowed into the hands of the owning class, and then through their hands, big chunks flowed back to Europe and fueled things like the rise of industrial capitalism in Europe. And when you tell the story truthfully, it says to us, capitalism always involves different forms of coercion. The most blatant and the most brutal is chattel slavery. But every form of labor in a capitalist society is unfree labor. Do the thought experiment. Ask yourself this. You're an employee in a kitchen in a restaurant. You see a rat run through the kitchen. If you walk out and tell the customers, you'll be fired. In other words, the system is inherently oppressive. For telling the truth, you will be dismissed because your job is to ensure the profitability of the company for your employer. That's the reality. And that's the fundamental substructure of capitalism, the exploitation and domination of labor. And so by bringing slavery and capitalism together like this and insisting that slave labor was foundational to the growth of the capitalist world system that we live in today, I'm challenging the dominant narrative that capitalism is about freedom. The final point I'll make on this is that central to the argument I want to make in the book is that slavery in the New World ended in the southern United States and across the Caribbean because the resistance of enslaved people became increasingly organized and powerful to the point that by Christmas of 1831 in Jamaica, they waged a strike of 30,000 enslaved people, and lo and behold, 2 months later, Britain abolished slavery in its colonies. And in the United States, as the great W.E.B. Du Bois, the first black man to ever get a PhD from Harvard, said, and by the way, W.E.B. Du Bois famously said, "The honor was all Harvard's, I assure you." As W.E.B. Du Bois said about the Civil War in the United States, it was the general strike of the slaves that broke the back of slavery. It was the 500,000 bonded people who left the plantations, fled to Union lines, 200,000 black men joining the Union Army and Navy, and I'll come back to this in another story later in the conversation. It was, in other words, the self-emancipation of enslaved people that got slavery out of our world. And that tells us that it's always going to be the common people. It's always going to be the oppressed. It's always going to be the working people of the world who are going to win freedom for us. And that's really what I'm trying to tell the story of in this book.
And this, I think, is crucial because, again, we see how all our common sense understanding of this evolution towards linear progress that supposedly our humanity is experiencing through the enlightened morality of the elite completely breaks if one reads this book. In fact, it's interesting, David looks at how the reason why Britain started advocating against slavery was because it was not in the interest of Britain to maintain slavery in place because of the highly more competitive position of the Americas when it was about trading cotton and other commodities. And of course, the very interesting point here is that slavery was not surmounted because of greater morality, but rather because it was politically untenable. Because indeed, and this is the fundamental point here that I would like you to dig deeper in, you're trying to tell us a lot of historians have got it wrong. It's not the case that we can reduce slaves to what you call constant capital, which is a big word, but ultimately it is about, you can't reduce slaves to property of someone else. because it is really the living labor, this activation of life that produces that wealth that then is captured by the elite. So in this living labor, and my question is thus, if we understand slaves as workers, how do we understand their struggle to escape this position of subordination? And what's fascinating of this book is all the different stories David tells about the different ways in which slaves organized to break free, and especially to reappropriate their time. And this is crucial, because when we talk about exploitation, we again have a moralistic understanding of it, just as, you know, very bad mistreatment in the labor process. The point here is to say, no, exploitation is actually the appropriation of part of the labor for the accumulation of someone else. So the appropriation of your activity and your output. And this is structural to accumulation. So could you tell us a little bit about the different ways in which these slaves organized to break free and why they became so powerful all the way breaking with liberation?
Let's start with the old narrative that needs to be challenged here. And this is the narrative that enslaved people were objects being bought and sold. When you think of slavery simply in those terms, you dehumanize. No human being is an object. No human being is a mere thing. There is living personality pulsating through these people, and they aspired to freedom in every imaginable way. Moreover, we tend to forget, particularly the mainstream tends to forget, as you say, these people were laborers. But what does that mean? It means they were producing the wealth of their masters. Now think about that for a minute. Because if you produce wealth for others, you have an often unseen power. And that's the power to stop working for them. Yes. That's the power to withdraw your labor. And contrary to what so many of the older histories thought, enslaved people withdrew their labor all the time. One of the great revelations in this regard is to read the actual diaries that the master class kept. They are constantly complaining about the enslaved people slowing down in the fields, about a bunch of them running off to the forest, and so on. They were engaged in a constant battle. And at the heart of that battle, of every freedom struggle by enslaved people and by oppressed people, is to reclaim time for themselves. Because the claim of power over you by any oppressing class is the claim to be able to control your time, to own your time. Enslaved people regularly fought and organized for fewer hours per day in the field, for more days away from the field. During the Great Haitian Revolution, for instance, which overthrew slavery in Haiti between 1791 and 1804, the 13-year war led by Toussaint Louverture to destroy slavery and to create the first independent black republic in the world, which is what they accomplished by 1804. In the course of that, the enslaved people regularly rose up for the 4-day work week, not the 6-day work week. Even for the 3-day work week and not the 6-day work week. Because time is life. Sage, you were speaking to this. Time is life and time is freedom. And to reclaim time for yourselves is to reclaim time for life. It's not the time in which someone else bosses you around. It's not the time in which you make somebody else rich. It's the time you nurture human relations. It's the time you work in your community, with your kin, with your friends. It's the time you celebrate. It's the time you worship. It's the time you dance. It's the time you sing. It's the time of what Susan Ferguson has called life-making. The time of life-making. Not time for someone else, not producing their wealth, making Elon Musk or Bill Gates or someone else fantastically wealthy. And so one of the incredible things about reading through this rich, rich history is that enslaved people organized over and over again to reclaim time. And one of the key ways of doing that was to flee the plantation. Because you're withdrawing your labor, but you have to withdraw yourself in a system of slavery. And they did that repeatedly and over again. Moreover, they fought for and won land for themselves, gardens, provision lands, and so on, where they could produce more and more for their needs. And then they fought for more time to work on their gardens and in their provision grounds than on the master's plantation lands, and so on. So they're fighting against producing commodities for others in order to produce life and the means of life. And I mean that in all its richness, from the vegetables you produce to the spiritual and cultural life that you're involved in. And this is why, to use the UCLA historian Robin Kelly's terms, the life of enslaved people is defined by freedom dreams. And one of the things that Dr. Kelly has been trying to say to us is those freedom dreams continue to speak to us because we have not yet accomplished the task of human freedom.
Thank you, David. I have so many questions. Maybe just something brief. Another important point here to make is that, again, it's not about bad masters. That narrative is, again, very individualistic and missing the point of understanding what are the pressures that pushed slave owners, capitalists, to constantly try to extract more labor time and more effort from their slaves. And how ultimately this dynamism that is what people are happy about when you discuss capitalism, everyone is like, well, of course, it's a system that innovates very quickly. It's a system that is able to advance quicker than any other system. You explain well how this dynamism that was very true also for the plantation economy was based on the need to increase productivity to beat competitors. So in a way, how the slave owners themselves were trapped in an economic system that had them, of course, compelled to oppress the slaves more and more. So I thought about this because I do think that to understand liberation, we do need to understand how it's not just by substituting one individual with another that things can change. We need to be able to question what are the forces that us as humans we put into place and then trap us in certain oppressive directions. So maybe just a thought on this.
Yeah. Well, and really, Clara, what you're getting at is the flaw in the bad apple theory.
Yes.
The bad apple theory says, the barrel's nice. The barrel itself is entirely healthy, but there's the odd bad rotten apple in it that we need to get rid of, as opposed to recognizing that the barrel is rotten to the core, okay? And the reason we need to understand this is that because the oppressive way that dominant classes in a capitalist society act isn't just because they're sadistic and mean-spirited. By the way, an awful lot of them are. But it's not just because of that. Let's do the thought experiment. If I'm a capitalist and I'm running a shoe factory in competition with other shoe factory producers, and I decide I'm going to be an enlightened and well and benevolent employer, and I decide you guys only have to work the 6-hour day, not the 8-hour day. And you know what? You get 3 days off each week, not 2. And you know what? Poverty wages aren't fair. Let me double wages. Okay? All of that is morally great. But the problem is I've just made myself an uncompetitive capitalist. I can't survive in the rat race of capitalism by raising the wages of all my workers, cutting all of their hours, because some other capitalist in the system is going to seize my markets because I've got to raise my prices because I just raised the wages. In other words, it's the system that enforces malevolent behavior. It's the system that rewards oppression. This is a system that rewards us for exploiting others. And that is a fundamental flaw inherent in the system. And what I try to show in the book is that because the plantations of the New World were large-scale modern business operations, just like corporations, they had to behave in exactly the same way as well. That's why the system had to be taken down. You couldn't just get rid of a handful of slave masters and leave a nice slavery in place. The system had to be taken down because structurally, inherently, it was exploitative.
Thank you, David. And this is very interesting because in analyzing what exploitation is about, we analyze and understand the power of those who are being exploited. And of course, David cites Hegel with the master-slave relationship. The master needs the slave, and this is still true today. So I would like to maybe hop to really focusing on what I think is the theme of tonight's talk, which is the fact that if we see capitalism as not about markets, but about relations of production, we also begin to see how it's much more precarious and fragile than we would think. And this, of course, the history of slavery very well shows how ultimately once the slaves rose up in these labor struggles, they ultimately won. So it's interesting because this connects very well with my research on austerity, which ultimately says, you know what? Our system is so unnatural that the state has to constantly intervene to maintain those pillars of the system, wage labor and private property of the means of production, in place. The state has to constantly protect the foundations of our economy. And you know, what's interesting to me in reading your book is that, you know, slaves knew who to hide from, knew who to poison. They knew who the master was and could see him in the face. What happens today with workers is, of course, that the compulsion is no longer personal and political, economic and overtly political, but it's impersonal. I teach my students this in one of the first classes. It's about market dependence. If we want to make it throughout our life and not end up in the streets losing everything we got, including our humanity, we got to pay our bills. And this is the most obvious thing everybody knows. This is why actually economics should not be taught by professors who don't experience too much economic compulsion, but by people who actually know what the economy is about. So this economic compulsion, the fact that if I want to eat, if I want to sleep, if I want to go to school, if I want to pay if I want to get cured, I got to have this money in my pocket. And this is ultimately the compulsion that is an evolution from the typical compulsion that was the one under slavery as a first form of capitalism. So in my work, I tried to show how austerity plays this fundamental role of making sure that market dependence is constantly preserved. And this is done through state intervention. And this is very important because when you hear not just the Republicans, but the Democrats tell you, we need to balance the budget. We need to cut social expenditures because we're spending too much. They're giving you an illusion that we're talking about more market, less state. As if the state is kind of backtracking and saying, hey, let the spontaneous free market be, we're just gonna step back. The reality here is that what's happening is that the state is constantly intervening, but this time to shift resources away from working people in favor of the saving, investing few. This is what austerity is about. It has very little to do with virtuous, living within our means, or with the idea of economic efficiency and rationality. The economic rationality, better, stems in the fact that you need to preserve the compulsion that allows for people to have no other choice but to wake up the next morning and go to work for a wage, and usually a very lousy one. So this for me is crucial because we can connect also with Michelle's experience here. Because, you know, what the latest big, beautiful bill, so-called, passed on July 4th this summer. What was that about? It was about really disclosing the inhumane but very powerful logic of austerity. Guess what? It's a very expensive bill. It's actually, we're gonna have over $4 trillion in the next decade to pay of debt. But what's happening here is that the money taken away, and we're talking about 200 billion stripped from food assistance, and other billions stripped from Medicare, and Medicaid. This money is getting, we have 150 billion that the state, from Medicaid is actually 500 billion that is being stripped in the next decade, right? So it's 500 billion in the next decade, actually, from Medicaid, and 200 billion from food assistance. This money is being spent differently. So we have 150 billion spent in arms, extra defense. The budget now in defense expenditure is touching 1 trillion, the highest in the history of the United States. The money is being spent how? Another 150 billion on surveillance of the borders, making sure that we are actually, you know, sponsoring the private profit of the military and the military-industrial complex, the prison complex, and the big technology. Ultimately, we are sponsoring the genocide while we cut off our social expenditures. In the meantime, austerity is also about having capital being taxed much less than labor. And this, again, seems very cruel, but it has an economic logic. The economic logic is, under capitalism, you want to incentivize investors, making sure that they do invest and that you attract them from abroad, so you better keep those taxes low. In the meantime, you are overtaxing labor so that, again, the burden is to go work in order to pay those taxes with your bills. So this logic, I think, is very much in the DNA of the system, and in my work I've shown how it's meant to disempower. But we can't always and forever be disempowered because, again, if you see the effort that is put in disempowering us, you realize we can never be disempowered. And this is the big lesson one learns from this book. So turning it to you, Michelle, I would like to have you talk about your experience as someone who, in Congress, sees what's happening and tries to push back.
Well, first I want to clarify that I am not in Congress. I'm in the Oklahoma House of Representatives.
Sorry, right, because it's not
so I didn't vote on the big beautiful bill. I had no ability to stop it. I just want to be very clear. I will own state issues for sure because I'm wearing the same jersey, but the federal people's on a different team. So a lot of these points are interesting for me to talk about because I'm in the minority party in the House. I'm a Democrat and there are only 20 of us, but I'm also in the minority as far as identities. So I'm a woman and there are a lot more women in the Democrat caucus than the Republican caucus, but there still are not a lot of us in total. There are only a few Black representatives. There are only a few queer folks, and by few I'm talking about like less than 5 here. And so a lot of my perceptions are not shared, so I'm up here nodding and agreeing with this stuff. These are things that I have lived with and known and researched, not that I'm at your level of expertise, but like things that I've always kind of dealt with in my life. And that's not kind of who your elected officials are. And one of the points made earlier, I think, is really important in spaces like this. The government is not going to correct itself. It's not. There is no incentive when you get into one of these seats to change the system that you benefit from. So it has to come from the pressure that you all put onto us. And that's why I say this is kind of funny, because my colleagues go out and I'm being like, you should call us and email us and show up and harass us and watch us. You need to pay attention to what we're doing on the floor. And that is not the normal thing that you hear from your elected officials, but a lot of what happens in the House and in the Senate, no one is watching us. And so people know that I can vote however I want to vote, I can run whatever bills I want, nobody's going to hear about it. Or just the people that support me are going to hear about it. And so it limits the conversations that we can have. And one of the challenges that I have, there are a lot of faces that I don't know, so I'll give you a little context to me running. I was an educator, a certified teacher and school librarian before this. I worked for Tulsa Public Schools for 14 years. I have 2 kids, one just turned 22 yesterday, and then I have a 14-year-old son in 9th grade. For me, going into the House of Representatives was technically a pay raise, and I greatly appreciate it, but it isn't a lot in actuality. But because it's not a lot, it is not as frequent for someone at my income level to enter into it. And so then whenever you get into office, there are a lot of privileges and special treatment that come with it, even from just well-meaning people. I don't know how many times somebody tries to tell me, like, oh, well, you don't have to wait in line, or you don't, and I'm like, yes, I do. I'm just a person. It's fine. But the expectation that I see from others is we think a lot of ourselves. We are put on a pedestal. And I think that it is good to have some reverence for your government leaders to a degree. They are supposed to be leaders. But we are regular people. The requirements for this job is to live in your district for 6 months and be a registered voter, be 21, and not have a felony. And they do not do a background check. They just ask you, do you have a felony? So if you go and you listen to the points that some of us make, or you hear some of us read out loud, it becomes very apparent that there's some things lacking there. We made shopping cart theft more illegal this year. And I brought up the point of like, hey, you know, if stores are that worried about their shopping carts being stolen, they could, you know, do like Aldi's does and charge you a quarter. There are all kinds of things that they could do. And the response that I was met with was, well, a store in my district is losing $250,000 a year. And at first I was like, oh, okay, that's problematic. Are we talking about like a mom and pop? We were talking about Walmart. Me personally, there's not a time where I'm concerned about Walmart's loss of funding or revenue or whatever. They have plenty to make it up. And they are a large enough company. They account for shopping cart theft in their budget. That's why they don't have any measures to keep their shopping carts. They know. They know. And I don't know about you guys, but I've never seen anybody roll up to Walmart in their Land Rover and start shoving baskets in the back. So we're going to take somebody who doesn't have a place to live, doesn't have any money to pay fees. We're going to jail them, which is great because at least now we're providing them shelter, which is something we don't want to do to just help people. We can only do it as a punishment, which is really weird. And then we're going to charge them a fine that they also can't pay. Then we'll jail them for that as well, and so continue to shelter them. But we could have sheltered them just for a moment, and then they never would have stolen the shopping cart. And so it's very true. It's very true that any change, any progress, any movement has to come from you all. And the reality of it is it does not matter how great a person wants to be before they get elected. They have to be ready to come into this space and make some tough choices. I have stood up and debated bills and then been told, we really wish you hadn't done that. Not because people disagreed with what I was saying, but because every time I debate, it costs Democrat representatives. The reason there's no impeachment of Ryan Walters is because there are not enough votes in the Senate for it to be done. And if you are the one to file that legislation and you don't have support for it, especially if you're in the minority for me, because I have a lot of people ask me, and I think we've certainly met the threshold of impeachment. But the reality is, if I go and file articles of impeachment tomorrow, I may not ever be able to adequately represent my district in any other way. I may not ever get a bill heard in committee. I may not ever get one on the floor. because it is everybody trying to hold on to their little bit of power and influence, and they've been allowed to do it without the people for far too long. And so when the only consequences are within our body, you're going to start acquiescing to the body. And there are a lot of people that I work with that are great people and have great hearts, but they are trying to stay in office to continue work the same way that I am, and so it causes you to compromise. And so what I always ask the people in my district is like, do you really want me to do this? And here's the cost, and like, is that okay with you? And if my district says, yes, we'll back you, whatever, then that's the way that I can move. But I don't hear from my district enough to know. I'm working on it, I'm trying. So it really has to come from the people. It has to not just come at the ballot box, but every time we file legislation, there should be somebody that we represent going, hey, what's this? Explain it to me. How does it benefit people? Who does it help and who does it hurt? Because lobbyists are at the Capitol all the time. And I was told very early on, when you get in there, you'll see how powerful the lobbyists are. And I was like, well, they can't vote for me, and they can't, like, what do you mean? How are they powerful? They can fund your campaigns, and they can fund your opponents. And that's what it really all comes down to, capitalism and money. And so that is the decision that a lot of us are left with. I am doing my best to make what I believe is the right choice every time, but I'm sure there are people that would disagree with me. But there is a difference when you get into these seats. I represent 30,000 people. They don't all agree, and I have to find balance in that as well. But the pressure of where money comes from, who's going to support you and stuff, that is a totally different story, and the people don't override that yet. Once you guys override the power of money, influence, and all, then we can start to see shifts.
Thank you, Michelle. So important. What you say resonates well with what we've discussed at our first free event with Camila Vergara on systemic corruption. Exactly saying the rules of the game are there to reinforce this specific economy we're in. And once more, just like businessmen are trapped in real competition and need to constantly find ways to increase the rates of exploitation, so too, in a way, Congress people are, and state representatives are trapped in dynamics that, of course, tend to incentivize the usual suspects. So can you tell us a little bit more about the local reality? If we're saying that austerity is about structurally defunding the resources we need for life, and what is fascinating, I think, about David's book is to see that actually slaves maintained a lot of autonomy in their space of life, much more than one would think. And the autonomy was also, of course, economic autonomy, the access to resources such as fish, such as wood, such as their gardens. This space of economic autonomy that was so crucial to be able to organize the resistance against the oppressor. So how is it here that in Tulsa, defunding schooling is part of this taking away this autonomy that could empower? And how did you see it growing up also here in Tulsa? And how did it affect you and your constituency?
Well, thankfully, I was in school for at least a little bit before No Child Left Behind. So I got to go on lots of field trips, and I had all these electives and these really, a robust kind of educational experience. I think one of the things that people forget about education, especially in Tulsa, this is not new. What the issues within Tulsa schools, some of the problems that we have, it's been consistent since the 70s. And what happened in the 70s? We integrated schools. So one of the facts that I always like to pull out when we discuss education, especially in Tulsa, is that Tulsa as a metro is 66% white. And Tulsa Public Schools student population is 21% white. Tulsa as a city, 66% white. Tulsa Public School students are 21% white. We are the largest district in the state. We are also we're just far enough away from Oklahoma City that our superintendent can lob bombs this way, and we're all at work and can't go bother him about it. That's the reality. Because Oklahoma City's metrics and numbers were the same and or worse in some areas. But where are all of those white children? From the 70s, when we integrated schools, they started moving their kids into schools in the neighboring districts. So Jinx, Broken Arrow, Bixby, Union, Owasso. They also started pushing them into private schools, charter schools. And we have bumped up the state level funding for those schools. It is not every individual's intention to push some form of segregation, but systemically what is happening is segregation of our schools. The inequities between racial groups gets exacerbated in schools. And if you take your child to a private school or to a charter school for a better opportunity because you have that option, that's great for your child, but it reduces the funding for every kid that does not have an option and that is a victim of the capitalist structure like everyone else. And so another aspect though, all of those white families have no reason to support their local schools. Their kid is not there. Their kid is not playing with the kids that are at that school, so they have no reason to be invested in it. And I don't mean that they just don't care, but they don't understand the connection necessarily. I hear it all the time, well, I don't have kids in school, why do I have to pay taxes for school? Well, you don't know how to read either, but you pay taxes for the library, so we pay for things that we don't use all the time. I pay for jails, and I would like to remain out of one. But there's this disconnect in community. Our society has gotten a lot larger. It used to be that your teachers, your principal, all of the students, everybody lived around the school. Everybody knew who your parents were. And so there was that village that kept an eye on you. I don't know how many times I've heard from older relatives about, well, back in my day, we would have called, around the corner and gotten so-and-so and whatever. I don't know who my neighbors are. We get in our cars in the morning and we drive away to work. And we drive to take our kids to school, and then we come back, and we're all exhausted. We're not out on the porch hanging out with people. We're not doing cookouts. We're a working neighborhood, so we go back in, and then we're disconnected again. And so that all kind of contributes to it. But also, educated people know when you're screwing them over. They know when something's not right. We're calling teachers indoctrinators because we teach kids how to think, and then they start looking around going, maybe the adults were lying to me. This looks a little sus. And we go, oh my God, they're indoctrinating their kids. And it's like, well, no, I took your kid to the library and they found a book with accurate history and realized that you're full of crap because they actually do know how to read. And so they read it and they went, oh, wait a minute. When people talk about, oh, my kids go off to college and they come back liberal, no, they met more than the 12 people in their neighborhood. And they started to go, I never thought about that. But they also share their ideas with others. So there are liberal kids that come back more conservative as well. But, it just is an exposure thing. And so there's a lot of aspects to it. It's keeping folks in poverty, because if you keep folks in poverty, you have a workforce. We lowered the income tax, which will actually cost the poorest folks about $9 a year, so not a whole lot. But my district, the average or the median income, those folks will save about $200 in a year, but they will spend it all in sales tax, because the poorer you are, the more you are purchasing. You are more frequently spending your money. You can't save money when you don't have a lot of it and when you can't stretch it. And so it is a kind of an all-encompassing thing. It's about race, it's about Christian nationalism, it's about capitalism, and it's not, again, the individual actors necessarily. Every person is not in a back room being like, oh, I'm gonna further Christian nationalism and destroy schools to have a workforce. They don't even realize that they're doing it. They don't understand. A lot of our legislators didn't go to public school or don't have kids in public school, so they don't even know what it was like. I was at an event earlier this morning, and somebody said, there's some legislation that's coming up to require seatbelts in school buses, and somebody was like, well, I didn't even know that wasn't a law. And I just thought, you never had to ride the bus before. There's not seatbelts on city buses either. You're just in there sliding around. But clearly you've never had that struggle, and you've not talked to people who have, so you've never considered that at all. I talk to people that have 5 or 6 kids, and they're all in private school. So what do you know about public? I don't know anything about private school, except for that you have to pay for it. That is all that I know. So why would I ever try to go and dictate that? And so it is so many parts and pieces, and fixing it requires so many different areas. One of the big things is social services. If my student comes to me and says, well, my dad got arrested last night and we're getting evicted tomorrow, why would you care about the Diary of Anne Frank? If you haven't eaten all weekend, come Monday morning, you don't really care about morning announcements. You don't care about school picture day. You have other things on your mind. But we won't pay for school meals. We won't increase the minimum wage. We won't make it easier for you to get health care. We won't increase supports for mental health services. So all of the societal problems, social problems that we're not addressing, then come into your school as well. The idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and everybody has to work for it and earn it is alive and well and very prevalent. I had another conversation this morning about homelessness, and it was like, well, what about the people that don't want to work? I don't care. First of all, it's a very small portion, and I don't care. I do not care if by giving somebody something that they didn't work for, my society as a whole is better. But that is not what we've been taught under capitalism. We all are supposed to work, and everyone is supposed to aspire to owning a business and being a billionaire. Yeah. Listen, for me, success is enough disposable income to get my nails done and to be able to eat poorly as much as I want and still be able to go to the doctor when I need to, and to be able to purchase books when I want. That's it. That's, for me, the American dream. Is I just want to have enough breathing room to enjoy the life that I have, the free time that I have. And we're stuck in this thing where we're like, everybody has to be productive. Think about what you did. For those of you that did not have essential jobs or allegedly essential jobs during the pandemic, what did you do in all of this extra free time that you had? Even if it was just that your commute got changed, I didn't see people going, you know what, I'm gonna get really good at Microsoft Excel. No, people were making sourdough bread and resin mugs and all kinds of things that every time I watch it, I'm like, I could do that. I can't, but I think so. And so we have to shift thinking about what society is supposed to be. And doing that will drop that higher end folks down, and they don't want that. And so they're gonna continue to pay and advocate for maintaining the status quo because it's beneficial to them, and we're also trapped in the rat race. It's hard to have a revolution whenever your lights are gonna get cut off. And they count on that. Someone asked me once, does the government take advantage of poor people? I said, absolutely we do. Yeah. Poor people gotta work. They can't show up and yell at us. Right. Hopefully they can't afford ammunition. Like, poor people can't interact with us in the same way. They can't give $1 million to an opponent to unseat me. They can't put out TV ads against me. And so it is easy to ignore that demographic unless you're making a conscious choice. But if that demographic is not loud, there's not really a lot of motivation. And politics does not draw in the best people. Or even the strongest, because when I say you get into this and you're gonna have to fight tooth and nail to not be like everybody else. I fight every day not to comment on people's posts and try to defend myself about something that somebody said, because the reality of it is I chose this job, which means that I get to be, rebuked and I get to be critiqued. And a lot of times they're not necessarily talking about me, but they're talking about the team whose jersey I have on, and that's the reality of it. But it's a multi-pronged thing. It's the same narrative about everything with poverty. If you keep people struggling, you have more power and influence.
Thank you. That was very, very powerful. Yes, and I think this is the whole point, is that the lived experience really reveals what we're also trying to say at a more conceptual level, which is there are clear political limits to what the governments under capitalism can do for you. Why? Because if you breach market dependence, if you give enough to people for them to actually have those spaces of life, to actually say, no, you know what? I'm not gonna go work for that shitty job the next day. That is dangerous for capitalism. And if you think about it, this is the whole point, even during the so-called golden age, when they were giving the birth of the welfare state in this country, everything was maligned as the dole. If you were on benefits, it was because you sucked. This is the narrative that justifies the fact that the state can't ever provide enough to the citizens or people to make their life good if they are not accepting to go and search for a job and get exploited. That's why you only get unemployment benefits if you're actively seeking a job. So I think it's very important to realize that under capitalism, there are political limits to social redistribution. And guess what? The money is there, it's just being used otherwise. And this is very important. I just wanted to throw out a number there because I forgot it earlier. The big beautiful bill is actually going to give, for those who earn more than $1 million a year, a collective tax break in 2027 of $114 billion, just in 1 year. While taxes on labor go up, while sales taxes go up, and of course sales taxes, guess who they affect? But let's turn it positive, and I would like to give the last word to David and open it up, because the whole point here, and I think this is very important, is to say that what we've been discussing is usually kept silent in a classroom. The models, the narrative, the theory of economics is meant to justify exactly the idea that those who produce wealth are the investors, are the capitalists. Those are the engine of the economic machine. In this story, if you look at the critical history already in David's book, you realize the opposite. Guess who produces that wealth? The free labor time of the worker who pays back the wage he or she earns and then works for free for the boss. This is where growth comes from in capitalism. And this is what is not told. And if you tell that story, you realize that the agency does not stand with the elite, it stands with the people. And thus the need to constantly protect capital holders and maintain the rest more and more precarious so they avoid complaining and, of course, organizing. So the positive note is, David, can you tell us a little bit about the spaces for alternatives that even slaves back in the day, pre-Civil War, had put into place and that led to finally the break with one form of oppression for us? Thank you.
Okay, I hope you'll let me cheat a little bit.
Yes, I will.
Okay, because a couple of things that Michelle said are so important that I want to be the history teacher that I am also for a moment and say something about the civil rights movement, okay? Number one, in exactly the ways that Michelle was talking about, the civil rights movement was a movement of the grassroots. It was a movement of people putting their bodies on the line saying, this does not go on, okay? But also, because there is this attempt to domesticate the legacy of Dr. King, I want to remind all of us what the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was saying in the last 2 years of his life when he launched his Poor People's Campaign. Because he saw the Civil Rights Act had been passed, the Voting Rights Act had been passed, and yet the inner cities were exploding in the United States. And Dr. King says to us in his writings, this woke me up to the fact that there can be no true justice without economic justice. And he then said, we have to challenge what he called the triplet. And the triplet was racism, militarism, capitalism. Okay? And I think that, you know, listening to Michelle, that it drives back home how there is no social justice agenda without an economic justice agenda to it. And this will finally, I'll stop cheating and come back to Clara's key question. Just like with the civil rights movement, one of the things I'm at pains to show throughout the book Slavery and Capitalism is that emancipation did not come from on high. Even the well-intentioned liberal myth that Lincoln freed the slaves, that's wrong. That is wrong. Lincoln was driven forward to take actions he had opposed because enslaved people were freeing themselves, and he had to go farther. He had to go farther because they'd already made it a fact on the ground that freedom was coming. They weren't waiting for the president to act. They were forcing the president to move. And that social process, which is the same social process of the civil rights movement, is something in these times where the great powers that be want to instill fear in us. And we need to understand that solidarity is the greatest antidote to fear in the world. You know, when in 1965, the civil rights marchers walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, of course they were afraid. There were cops everywhere. They had tear gas, they had hoses, they had dogs. And they linked arms and they sang and they grew bolder and they grew more courageous. They grew stronger and they crossed that bridge that day when every Dixiecrat politician had said, we will not let them pass. And they did. And that's really the ultimate thing. Capitalism divides in order to conquer. The antidote to that is solidarity and community and struggle. The freedom dream that I was talking about. And I'll really conclude by saying that in writing this book, Slavery and Capitalism, it was an incredibly humbling experience. Because as somebody who has been an activist since I was a teenager, involved in social movements and in social protest, full disclosure, there are times where you feel tired. There are times where you feel like you've been banging your head against a wall. And then you read about enslaved people who will not submit, who will not give in, who continue against horrifying odds to fight and to organize. And I will tell you something, if you're losing your hope, turn to those stories. These people brought the system of slavery down. And they did it with their courage, their solidarity, their community, their conviction. That's the biggest message that they do not want us to hear today. That ordinary people, common people, working class people, acting together and building bridges of solidarity can change the world. They've done it before, we can do it again.